participants.
Okay, that's good.
37, it's just building up, so we'll see.
Yeah.
Christophe is there.
Hello, Sophie.
Hello, Christophe. How are you?
I'm fine. The link was not working, so I was a bit worried.
The link didn't work. Oh, sorry.
No, but I could copy and paste, and that worked.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being here.
Add some light. It's a bit dark.
Hello, everyone. It's so good to see that everybody could connect finally.
Hi, Neha.
Hello, Neha.
Hi, Neha.
Hello.
So,
Thank you,
Pratinav,
Rashmi,
go back
for
to
all
your
the
alma
help.
mater.
Most welcome. Professor Jaffrelot, I'd like to introduce, I'm Rashmi, by the way, and
Yes.
I'd like to introduce our rector
Yes.
and
Good afternoon.
the Keith, Professor Jaffrelot.
Good afternoon, sir.
And
Good
congratulations in advance for the book.
Thank you, and thank you for organizing an important moment. So now it's not in our hands anymore. It's for the public. It's like children, when they they have to live their own life.
That is true.
So Pratinav, you are now in the hands of your two alma maters.
Yes. At the start, at Xavier's, we wish to promote three values of professional innovation, personal integration, and social inclusion. We would, of course, like our students to be creative, motivated by a socially inclusive vision and sentiment. As human beings, we are and need to be driven by certain basic normative aspirations. And two of these have to do with creating an open society and creating a just society. One question that we need to ask continually is, how can we create better conditions for freedom and justice to prevail, not just in our city or our nation, but in the whole world? And today's book release, the Indian version of it, and the discussion, I suppose, will feature this concern of creating adequate conditions for freedom and justice to prevail in society. So I'd like to thank the organizers as well as the resource persons for contributing positively and constructively towards this end. I wish you all the best and congratulations for the reception of the book.
Thank you, Father. I'd like to now invite Ms. Ankita Gujar to introduce our speakers.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour. Professor Christophe Jaffrelot is an internationally renowned expert on Indian and South Asian politics. He teaches at Sciences Po and is a CNRS senior researcher in political science at the Sciences Po Center for International Studies. He is also a visiting professor at the India Institute, King's College London, and has taught at Columbia University, Yale University, Johns Hopkins University, the Université de Montréal, and Princeton University. Since 2008, he has been a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His research is centered particularly in South Asia. His publications on India cover aspects of Indian nationalism and democracy, religious and caste mobilization in politics, and ethnic conflicts. In October 2019, he was elected as a member of the prestigious Academy of Moral and Political Sciences, which is one of the 5 academies of the Institut de France. Last November, he was also elected the president of the French Political Science Association. In India, he often writes columns for the Indian Express and the Caravan. Pratinav Anil, a DPhil candidate at the University of Oxford, works on Muslim politics in post-colonial India. Educated at the London School of Economics and Sciences Po, he has, between his degrees, briefly worked at the Centre de Recherche Internationale in Paris and the Gandhi Peace Foundation in Delhi, and as a farmhand in Vienna North. Welcome both of you, and thank you so much for taking the time out to engage in this conversation with us. And Professeur and Pratinav, merci beaucoup d'avoir accepté notre invitation pour cette série de conférences. C'est à vous.
Thank you so much. Sciences Po and St. Xavier's indeed are cultivating a great partnership, and Pratinav is the best illustration of what such partnership can result in. Also because we do share values, and when Father de Souza mentioned an open society and a just society as the objectives of St. Xavier's, of course, that rings a bell. And that's what we are also trying to promote at Sciences Po. But I would say more personally that I have always considered academic work as directed in this perspective, as one of my, I would say, deeper motivations. And if after 35 years, I continue to work on the same topics, it's precisely for promoting this, and teaching is definitely also why one of the ways and means for transmitting these values. This book clearly fits in this perspective. And it speaks about yesterday, but it speaks about today as well. We have divided the job between Pratinav and me to make sure that we cover the ground that this book is covering itself in 500 pages. So of course we cannot do justice to a detailed account. It's a very detailed book based on archives, which for many of them were not accessible in India. They will be now because we have digitized the hearings of the Shah Commission report, the Shah Commission at large, and we will summarize only the argument. It's a book that tries to respond to three questions. What was the emergency as a regime? This is the first part of the book. Why has it been imposed? And this is the second part of the book. And in this part, we do not look only at the immediate causes, but also we study the factors which have made the emergency possible. And the third part of the book is an attempt at, explaining why Mrs. Gandhi lifted the emergency after 21 months. That's another why. So Pratinav will deal with the whys of part 2 and part 3, and I will focus on the what. What regime? What was the emergency in terms of regime? And I'll come back after Pratinav to say a few words of conclusion so far as the meaning of the emergency in India's history is concerned, in a larger, I would say, comparative perspective. But let's try to define the emergency first. And I will try to do that by using different entry points. First of all, the legal entry point. What was it in constitutional terms, this regime, unprecedented regime in Indian history? But I will also try to use another entry point, that is the political economy. What kind of political economy was behind the emergency? And secondly, the what was the emergency question has to be, if you want, disaggregated in terms of time and space. Was the emergency the same over the 21 months? And was it the same across the board? India is a large country. Was the affecting the south and the north the same way? Of course not. And that's a very interesting question to ask. So this is what I'm going to do now, and I will be careful not to speak for more than 20 minutes or so. Just tell me if I'm going beyond this time limit. So in terms of regime, we define the emergency in this book as a constitutional dictatorship. And that's, by the way, a term that was used by some of the opponents of Mrs. Gandhi as early as 1975. Why? Why do we use this characterization? Well, because on June 26, at 2 a.m. at night, the President of the Republic of India signed a decree imposing the state of emergency according to Article 352 of the Indian Constitution. That was something legal. But of course, this legal decision had implications of an unprecedented scale, because to impose the emergency meant that fundamental rights guaranteed under Article 19 were suspended, which meant that the rights of free speech and expression, the right to assemble peacefully and without arms, quote unquote, the right to form unions, and even more importantly, the right to move the courts to enforce civil rights were suspended. It also meant that government officials in the states were answerable to the union government, overriding the principles of federalism. Centralization became the order of the day. And last but not least, when we say that freedom of expression was suspended, it meant censorship. The media had to get prior authorization for publishing news and op-eds. Well, that went along with the mass incarceration of politicians and journalists, by the way, which was rendered legal by the provisions I've just mentioned. That's something that was legal because Mrs. Gandhi followed the procedure of Article 352. So when she imposed this emergency, she went through all the steps that made it constitutional. For instance, she presented this decision at 7 a.m., 5 hours after the president had signed his decree, to the cabinet ministers. And only one of them, Defense Minister Swaran Singh, questioned the necessity of this action. And it was passed by the government as it had to be constitutionally. She made a point to be in the perimeter of the Constitution. And in fact, in the broadcast in her broadcast on the same day, she emphasized this decision. And she said that an extra constitutional challenge was constitutionally made. And of course, she referred to the demonstrations, agitation of the JP movement, and Pratinav will return to this immediate cause for the emergency. The point important for me is this claim that she was within the perimeter of the Constitution. Well, she was indeed, because the next step implied that she would ask the parliament to validate the emergency, and the parliament did. In fact, this is another very important dimension of the emergency. The Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha continued to meet. Many members of parliament were behind bars. Of course, opposition members of parliament, but those who were not continued to sit in parliament and to vote. So the Lok Sabha on July 23rd approved the declaration of emergency by 336 votes for and 59 against. And the Rajya Sabha had just done that one day before by 136 votes and 33 against. The pros and cons showed or suggested that parliament was functioning. And that's one of the ironies of the emergency. Opposition parties were not banned. Political parties were still functioning. And their MPs continued to sit in parliament, to debate, to vote, to oppose, even after their term was over, because there was no election for 21 months. At least the Lok Sabha elections that should have taken place in March 76 were postponed. And many MPs said, well, our term is over, we should resign. In fact, that's what socialists Madhulima and Sharad Yadav did and invited their colleagues to resign too. They did not, giving a kind of legitimacy to the emergency by sitting in parliament even beyond their term, which is one of the ironies indeed of the emergency. But parliamentarians were not the only ones which somewhat gave some legitimacy to the emergency. The judiciary did also. And the judiciary gave somewhat its blessing to the emergency on many occasions. The Supreme Court of India itself was supportive of some of the clauses, provisions of the amendments to the Constitution that the Parliament voted when Mrs. Gandhi introduced bills in this direction. For instance, the 42nd Amendment that completely transformed the regime and that was validated by the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court validated something even more surprising. The suspension of the habeas corpus. The government of India considered that now, under the emergency, there was no personal rights law for the time being. And the way the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, MISA, was used for putting behind bars thousands of Indian citizens was one of the things that the victims were challenging in the name of habeas corpus. Something like 100,000 Indian citizens, including many politicians, unionists, NGO activists, and so on, journalists, were behind bars in the name of MISA, many of them. So Shanti Bhushan, Soli Sorabji were the lawyers who went to the court and saying that this is against the habeas corpus notion and concept. But the Supreme Court of India on April 28, 1976, supported the government's position, except Justice Khanna, who was the only one who said there is no way you can suspend habeas corpus even under emergency. But he was in a minority. The verdict was, the court ruled 4-1. So yes, nothing illegal there. The emergency is not an illegal regime. It's a constitutional dictatorship for that very reason that institutions like Parliament and the judiciary did not made this decision to suspend democracy unconstitutional. And the judiciary certainly got a very bad name because of this attitude. Some of the judges, some of the justices regretted afterwards, but afterwards only. So that's one dimension for defining what was the emergency. Another dimension, as I said, has to do with the political economy of this period. Well, the emergency was declared by Mrs. Gandhi not only for defending the constitution, ironically, but also for defending the poor. It was supposed to be a revolution. She said, some people talk of revolution, our government has already begun one. So the idea was, well, if you go by the democratic system that was prevailing before, you cannot do justice to the poor because of the right to property, because of the way Congress party had to rely on local notables who were conservative to the core. So you have to suspend the democratic system for really helping the poor. And that's the philosophy of the 20-point program that Mrs. Gandhi enunciated. Well, with very uneven results. In fact, the emergency was supposed to, for instance, result in some land reform. Well, certainly 1.7 million acres were expropriated in the 21 months of the emergency. Less than 2/3 of these 1.7 million acres were redistributed. That means 1.1 million acres. And that is certainly more, that was certainly more than what she could redistribute between 72 and 75, 62,000 acres, but it was much less than what her father, Jawaharlal Nehru, had achieved. And you cannot consider that the poor peasants, the landless peasants, had fully benefited from this policy. In fact, the emergency is much more a pro-middle class regime. Private property remained sacrosanct, no doubt. And the middle class that was tired of agitations, because there was the JP movement, Pratinav will return to it, but there was also the 1974 railwaysmen strike, and so many other agitation. Well, with the emergency, the middle class returned to normalcy, discipline, and trains arrived on time, as we said at that time. More importantly, the emergency was a productivist regime, and it was a productivist regime at the expense of the workers' rights. In fact, you see that in the way strikes were made illegal. There is a ban on strikes. There is a ban on union. Trade unions were not banned, but something like 2,000 unionists were locked up. That was the idea. The same way parties were not banned, but thousands of politicians were behind bars. The symbol of this productivist regime was the making of a corporatist system of management of the economy. Mrs. Gandhi created a national apex body within which workers and management of both the private and the public sectors were invited, as she said, to sit together and try to find ways of solving problems. The idea was to somewhat run the economy jointly. But of course, the main beneficiaries of this system were the capitalist milieu. And Pratinav will return to that. But one of the main supporters, or some of the main supporters of the emergency, were the corporate sector. And most of the industrialists, including J.R.D. Tata, including K.K. Birla, were supportive of the emergency and were happy with the kind of discipline that was back in the factories. Never forget that the nickname in a way of the emergency was an era of discipline. That says a lot. So we have broadly characterized the emergency by using these two terms, constitutional dictatorship and corporatism in terms of the whole economy. Now, let's turn to this question. Was the emergency the same over 21 months? Was the emergency the same across the country? Of course not. In terms of the timeline, it's very difficult to identify a turning point, a milestone. And in fact, you can say that there's only one emergency, not two. But at the same time, there is a shift in emphasis because of the rise of Sanjay Gandhi, whose emergency will be somewhat different from her mother's emergency. Well, Sanjay, a very young man, had created its own group. He patronized a group of supporters who owed their allegiance to him and to him alone. In this group, you found former Chief Minister of Haryana, Bansilal, and other bureaucrats, including Jagmohan, who was in charge of the Delhi Development Authority. The list is longer. I don't want to give too many names. What I mean is that he had his own clique, if you want, and he was in a position to impose his own men gradually at the expense of Congress veterans, including Swaran Singh, the man who, the only one who had objected to the declaration of emergency on June 26. But others, other heads rolled, including I.K. Gujral, who was sent as ambassador to Moscow, but who used to be before the INB minister. So Sanjay was gradually gaining momentum, and he had an instrument for that, and that was the Youth Congress. He had the Youth Congress behind him, and the Youth Congress became his instrument for mobilizing supporters. What for? Well, for his own program. Sanjay did not have the 20-point program, but the 5-point program on his agenda. And that was announced on 22nd of February 76. You can certainly argue that early 76, if you look for a milestone, was the time when Sanjay Gandhi asserted himself at the expense of Mrs. Gandhi, even though, of course, she remained in the driver's seat. In the driver's seat, but with a lot of room for Sanjay now. What for? For two kinds of programs. In fact, in this 5-point program, there are two things which define Sanjay's emergency. One is family planning, and the other one is cities gentrification. Family planning is, of course, an understatement for sterilization, because after 76, from 76 onwards, each state was given sterilization targets, and the number of forced sterilizations increased tremendously. By and large, during the emergency, something like 11 million people were sterilized, especially in 76. That's one major stigma on the emergency era. Definitely, in the collective memory, it is remembered for that primarily. But the gentrification of Delhi was another priority for Sanjay. And during the emergency, something like 700,000 people were displaced from inner city Delhi to mostly Muslim and Dalit ghettos and slums in the peripheral conurbations, with one particularly dramatic event in April 76, when in Turkman Gate, Muslim people resisted but were repressed, and the bloodshed that followed is another stigma that is remembered even today, and not only in Delhi. Delhi was the epicenter. And let me turn to the last point I wanted to make about the geography of the emergency. It was not the same everywhere. Delhi was the epicenter for sterilization and rehabilitation of slum dwellers. The Indie Belt at large was the clearly the main, if you want, epicenter of the emergency, with a core made of Haryana and West Uttar Pradesh. If you go beyond that, of course, the whole of the Indie Belt, Rajasthan, Himachal, Madhya Pradesh, and Bihar, were certainly among the most affected states. In contrast, you can say that two states were affected very late in the day, Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, because these two states were governed by the opposition to begin with. So for the first 10 months, you did not see the impact of the emergency in these two states. I mean, not very dramatically. There were still opposition fugitives finding refuge in these states. It's not surprising that the Baroda dynamite case was in Gujarat. The press was rather free also in Gujarat and Tamil Nadu. The DMK government was dismissed only in early 76 in Tamil Nadu. So these are very interesting exceptions, and that's something people don't remember. Nobody thinks about the continuation of regular politics, in some places during the emergency, but that's why it is so uneven. And the South at large was more preserved. And when you try to understand why some of these states somewhat escaped the hardship of the emergency, well, there are two explanations. One, opponents were at the helm, so opposition parties, of course, we are not bowing to the center. But two, some of the Congress chief ministers resisted the orders coming from Delhi. And it's a clear reflection of how some chief ministers were not the sycophants. There were many sycophants appointed by Sanjay like ND Tiwari and others in the north. There were few in the south. And for instance, Devraj Urs in Karnataka was his own man and could use somewhat the emergency for progressive measures and policies. So it's one of the explanations for the uneven imposition of the emergency. And you see that in the 1977 election results, because if the Congress was rooted in the Indie Belt in 77, only one congressman was elected across the Indie Belt as member of parliament. But if you look at what happened elsewhere in the South, Congress resisted very well. It did very well in Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh. In these four states, it got a very large fraction of the votes, 56% in Karnataka, 57% in Andhra Pradesh. It's very interesting to see that for them, the emergency did not carry the same stigma. That's the best word I can think of, that in the North. So that's what we do in the first part of the book. We somewhat disaggregate the emergency in terms of time and space, and we try to defend the regime from a constitutional as well as a political economy-oriented perspective. And I will now let Pratinav tell you what we do in part 2 and part 3. If I've not been, hopefully I've not been too long. Pratinav.
Well, thanks, Christophe, and thanks, Rashmi, for having us here. Sophie and Naya for organizing this. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'll keep this brief. I'll begin with a word about the causes of the emergency, then move on to a brief gloss analysis of the regime, and finally make a few remarks about the return to democracy. So on to the causes of the emergency. Very briefly, we find 3 explanations for the coming of the authoritarian regime. Now, if one picks up a book of the many journalistic accounts of the 1970s, what one typically finds is an account of a mad dictator. And to be sure, there's an element of truth in this. Mrs. Gandhi was very much, in Adorno's language, an authoritarian personality. But for all that, it must be said that a penchant for authoritarian rule alone cannot take a country down the road to dictatorship. A second explanation for the emergency turns on what could be called a vulgar Marxist interpretation of Indian history. And this was put forth most forcefully by the German sociologist Andre Gunder Frank. So on his account, it was India's capitalists who pushed for dictatorship. Faced with strikes and unrest in the early 70s, they decided to strike back. And they found a vehicle in the Congress which declared the emergency on their behalf. Now, stepping back from the 70s, some of these arguments do make some sense. But on closer examination, a number of facts sit uncomfortably. Why, for instance, was the 25th of June, 1975, the turning point? By then, the forces threatening both the Congress and the capitalist class were certainly on the wane. Inflation had been brought under control. The JP movement, more on which in a minute, was losing its way. We think it is obvious then that capitalists were not the emergency's raison d'etre. In truth, they merely welcomed and supported it. A third narrative follows from an interpretation of the emergency's immediate cause. The High and Supreme Court verdicts of June 1975 on Mrs. Gandhi's electoral malpractices, which held the possibility of her ouster. So in this version of events, the June judgments were the judiciary's revenge, only the last move in a beef between 2 of Montesquieu's 3 independent powers, the executive and the judiciary. To Mrs. Gandhi's executive, the courts were trying to derail social reform. The judiciary had its own troubles. Government, an instrument of social change by concentrating power in her hands. Here the answer lies in her rise to power. When she became Prime Minister in 1966, it was widely understood that she was a stopgap Prime Minister, a Nehru carefully chosen to ensure dynastic continuity and popular legitimacy. But luckily for her, the Congress's poor showing in 1967 in the election meant that most of her nemesis, the right-wing party bosses, went down in defeat. It also helped that the Congress left was ascendant at the time. So Mrs. Gandhi underwent a Damascene conversion in the late 60s, declaring that she too was on the left. Remarkably, she managed to pile massive majorities in the elections of the early 70s, promising land reform, and more ambiguously, an end to poverty. But as the years wore on, it became clear her socialist rhetoric was one thing, her rule in practice quite another. So why did she fail to deliver on her promises? In part because she was hoist with her own petard. This is because at the heart of deinstitutionalization was a catch-22. On the one hand, it entailed dismantling the old guard. But on the other, it also meant that with fewer patrons, the party's coffers also grew harder to refill. Her fledgling chief ministers also proved completely inept at seeing through the implementation of land reform. So in effect, by deinstitutionalizing the party and failing to follow through with her populist promises, Mrs. Gandhi had alienated not just the traditional elites, but also the masses. Alienating the landless and smallholders at a time when 4 out of 5 Indians lived in the countryside was a bad idea. It did not help that with the Green Revolution, the poor peasantry had actually become even poorer. So a Maoist insurgency came to have a presence in 1/3 of India's districts. You also had peasant uprisings in Andhra Pradesh and West Bengal, both of which were brutally put down by the state. But it was not just peasants, but also the middle classes, students, the gentry, and the working classes, whose grievances multiplied in the early 70s. The gentry worried about the worsening terms of trade between agriculture and industry. The working class, the crippling of unions. The bourgeoisie, the erosion of real income. And students, the bleak job prospects ahead of them. All of these strata, in some form or the other, wound up identifying with Jayaprakash Narayan's movement, which remains to this day the most important extra-parliamentary threat that an Indian ruler has faced from his people. By the time of the emergency, the JP movement had provoked the fall of one Congress government in Gujarat and threatened a second one in Bihar. Not to mention that the entire country had been gripped by protests, strikes, and popular discontent. Mrs. Gandhi's reaction then was to double down on centralization with a limited recourse to violence. The upshot, in other words, was the emergency. So much for the causes of the emergency. What explains its relative longevity? Certainly no one at the time felt the transition from democracy to dictatorship would be smooth and last for nearly 2 full years. The answer, we think, lies in the coalition of interests that supported the regime and the weak resistance that opposed it. The emergency was not deeply unpopular. Early on in it, the opposition felt that, and I quote one Lok Sabha MP, "If she keeps this up, we might have a dictatorship by popular will." And indeed, what emerges from our survey is the wide range of actors that back the emergency regime. Among its most vocal supporters were the Communist Party of India and the private industrial empires, the middle classes and the bureaucracy. And this only goes to show that the emergency regime had no real ideology as such. Mrs. Gandhi was too keen to try and win over all these groups on their own terms for her to have a serious program of her own. The communists, for their part, threw their weight behind what they believed to be Mrs. Gandhi's progressive regime, and rather disingenuously, they also believed that she would rein in big business. As for big business itself, it welcomed the emergency with both hands. Wealth taxes were slashed, a moratorium was placed on nationalization. And if big business found cause to celebrate, so too did the bourgeoisie. They benefited from Sanjay's gentrification program, for one. For another, they discovered a taste for discipline, in the sense that Indira Gandhi meant it. Like in Mussolini's Italy, trains ran on time. Overnight, strikes disappeared. The proletariat and the pesky unions had been put in their place. Well, if the middle class was won over with carrots, the bureaucracy was tamed by sticks. 26,000 public servants were prematurely retired. Thereafter, the rest showed up on time to their offices every day, duly implementing the regime's programs, however transgressive. Large sections of the intelligentsia supported the regime as well. A number of vice-chancellors came out in favor of it. Universities readily complied with authoritarian measures, even allowing policemen to enroll themselves as students to spy on campus activity. And in Maharashtra, the Shiv Sena supported the regime as well, as did a number of Dalit parties that were successors to Ambedkar's Republican Party of India. In effect, it was large sections of both the left and right that supported the regime, quite literally from communists to capitalists, from Dalit parties to the Brahmanical intelligentsia, from the bureaucracy to the bourgeoisie. While there was broad support for the regime, instances of resistance were few and far between. So in the milquetoast media landscape, for example, only a handful of papers, such as the Indian Express and the Statesman, took up the cudgels for democracy. In the judiciary, a few high courts challenged arbitrary incarceration, but for the better part, the courts, especially the Supreme Court, fell in line. The Hindu nationalists of the RSS marched against the regime, courting arrest in a few places, but its leaders quite happily tried reaching a deal with Mrs. Gandhi. What the RSS wanted was hegemony, not democracy. Democracy mattered only to the extent that it facilitated achieving hegemony. Parliamentarians, for their part, allowed Mrs. Gandhi to keep up the pretense of democracy by legitimizing the lower and upper houses through their attendance. As for the two strands of the revolutionary underground, one socialist and the other Hindu nationalist, both were of little account. So all in all, it could be said that the resistance proved a damp squib. It was not then, and it cannot be stressed enough, the resistance that brought about the end of India's first dictatorship. Which brings me to the third and final remark. Why did Mrs. Gandhi suddenly call time on the emergency and announce a snap election in January 1977? The most important reason, we think, is that she thought she would win. And this had two implications. First, it would restore legitimacy to her rule, both in the eyes of the foreign press, whose approval she so craved, as well as to a domestic audience, the press, civil society, opposition parties. The second implication was that an election held the possibility of a smooth succession from her to her son. When the Congress got down to the business of fielding candidates, she saw to it that 200 of them were picked by Sanjay. Of course, this never transpired because the Janata Party was formed not long after, and Jagjeevan Ram, her trusted lieutenant and leader of the Dalits, left the party. She panicked and began courting the old guard. Instead of Sanjay's backroom coronation, we got Sanjay's electoral cremation. The negative reaction of the foreign press to the emergency played a part as well. Criticism poured in from The Guardian, unsurprisingly, but also from the London Times and the Washington Post. We know from Mrs. Gandhi's correspondence that she cared about Western opinion, even obsessed over it. And we also know that she was rather taken aback by Zulfikar Bhutto's decision in Pakistan to head to the polls. This upset the self-respecting nationalist in her, a democratic Pakistan and an India under dictatorship. So 11 days after Bhutto's announcement came her own. So it was that democracy returned to India, as the narrative goes. But this begs the question, what kind of democracy was it? I'll leave it to Christophe to make a few remarks about Indian democracy, the emergency and its place in the country's history. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Pratinav, and thank you, Professor Jaffrelot. I think we can take some questions now. There are some questions in the chat box, which one of our students, Tarini, will be reading out for you. So over to you, Tarini, if you want to start reading the questions, please.
Good evening. I'm Tarini. I'm a first-year student at St. Xavier's, and I'll be reading out questions on behalf of the audience. So our first question is by Radhika Bhide. She says, there are many controversial regimes all over in the world of politics. What was it that made you choose this particular Indian regime, and what was your inspiration?
So, Pratinav, shall I respond first?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Well, simply because this is a project I had for many decades. In fact, as we explained in the preface, I had signed a contract for writing a book on the emergency in the 90s already. And I could not do this job. And meeting Pratinav made this book possible. Why looking at the emergency? Well, first of all, why not? You know, this is not such a stupid response. Why had nobody done it before? Almost, at least in the 90s, we had no book on the emergency except personal testimonies like Kuldeep Nayyar's testimony. Some books were published subsequently by M.R. Tarlow, by Gyan Prakash, by others. But at that time, there was no book. And that was very intriguing, as if this period had to remain a black box. Well, it's a very interesting black box. It's very interesting to open this black box. And I would have probably looked at other black boxes if I had not been a specialist of India. But being a specialist of India, I really wonder why that remained unaddressed as a period that is very interesting by itself, for itself, in itself, but as a period that is also very revealing of what kind of democracy prevailed in India, what kind of democracy is so easily reduced to silence. And therefore, it's not only about 21 months, it's about the way a country is living its democracy, how deeply attached or not are people to freedom. You know, journalists were asked to bend and they crawl, said Advani after the emergency. Why? Why so few people resisted? And what does it tell us about the political culture, the democratic culture? And what does it tell us about today? So I think these are ways to respond to your questions.
Thank you, Professor. Our second question is by Shruti. She asks, what was your research process for this book? And how difficult was it to ascertain the historical facts?
Pratinav, this is for you.
Well,
as an historian.
As a historian, and these are the kind of questions we ask ourselves all the time. How reliable are our sources? And luckily for this project, what we had were two contrasting sources that gave us a very good picture of the emergency together. So first you had the press, and as I mentioned it in the talk, it was a milquetoast media landscape. It was basically an arm of government in a sense. So really reading through the Statesman, the Indian Express, and the Times of India really gave you an understanding of what the regime was doing and what it thought it was doing. And then after, as we mentioned, that after the emergency, the junta came to power and they investigated the excesses of the regime. So that's when we got the other side of the story from the Shah Commission testimonies, which we have now digitized. So between the two, we were able to piece together a fairly coherent narrative of the emergency regime.
All right. The next question is by Deepthi. She asks, in your opinion, why do you think the Indian Express survived through the censorship even during the emergency?
That's a very interesting question. You have two newspapers, in fact, that somewhat resisted the emergency, Indian Express and also Statesman, the Statesman. Others tried to resist, but had to close down because the repression was too severe. And you had smaller initiatives like Imal and others, but certainly Indian Express stood apart. And that's why the subtitle, is now journalism of courage. This is the legacy, I suppose, of the emergency. Well, this is where you see that personalities matter. You have institutions and you have the people who make institutions work or not. And I mentioned the way Justice Khanna was the only man who resisted the habeas corpus case in the Supreme Court. You can say that among journalists or among newsmen, Ramnath Goenka was one of the few who resisted oppression. And they tried hard to reduce Ramnath Goenka's will to resist. He had to compromise on some, you can say, procedural arrangements. The board of the Indian Express was reformed. K.K. Birla joined this board and tried to impose his own will. He was clearly asking for a Rajya Sabha seat in return, and finally he will get it, but much later on. The point is, Ramnath Goenka and his journalists, including Arun Shouye at that time, many others, were adamant to resist as much as they could, making some concessions to make sure that they would remain somewhat below the radar. But this is a reflection of personalities, I repeat. And some people resisted fear when others fell in line. And most of the people fell in line. Another man, of course, at the Indian Express, who made such a big difference, was Kuldeep Nayar. And Kuldeep Nayar, who died recently, wrote 2 books, but especially one, The Judgment, that should be read, at least should be read in schools of journalism, if there is something like that in India and elsewhere.
Thank you, Professor. Our next question is by Shivani. She asks, how did the emergency situation in India affect our relationship with our allies? And what was their reaction?
That's our next op-ed, Pratinav.
Well, precisely. And the question is, who exactly is an Indian ally? And that's where we see that what India was doing was playing a very difficult balancing game, because on the one hand, the Soviet Union and its allies saw India as its ally, and so did the West as such. And what India managed to do was convince both these audiences that the emergency regime was what India needed, for what the government needed for its people. And of course, more importantly than trying to convince the press, because the press was not very well convinced in the West, especially the London Times and the Washington Post, was trade relations, because that's what India really depended on, and aid as well, because we need to remember that the fifth five-year plan, which was co-equal to the emergency, depended a fifth of its sum on foreign aid. And India is very happy to keep that money coming in. And they did so by signing a number of contracts, dispatching Indian labor to the Middle East to work for American corporations, fixing the exchange rate to suit the Soviet Union's interests, signing arms deals with Britain, and giving a free pass to American journalists under the radar. So between all of this, we see that Western governments, as well as the Soviet bloc, were basically bought off by the emergency regime. And this really didn't change foreign policy all that much until the very late months of the emergency, when things began changing and Mrs. Gandhi became more paranoid about what the Western press thought about and what Western governments did, because at some point, even President Ford decided to cancel a trip to India, as did Lord Louis Mountbatten and a number of others, in fact. Thank you.
Our next question is by Professor Chrissy da Costa. She asks, do you think one of the factors that made the emergency possible was that the Indian society is so fractured along the lines of caste and religion?
Well, this is a reversible argument. You can say, on the contrary, that it's because India is so diverse that it has to be democratic. How do you make people live together if you do not respect this diversity? And diversity can be can go with pluralism. Pluralism being, of course, the root cause for democracy. So it's certainly part of the solution more than part of the problem. And for me, if there is a decline of the democratic culture, it's because there is less and less diversity, in fact. And the temptation to impose a majoritarian identity and culture in the country. That was not so much the case during the emergency period. And the emergency was probably much less sustainable in the 70s. I mean, authoritarianism was probably much less sustainable in the 70s, precisely because of this diversity. And if Mrs. Gandhi finally decides to organize elections, it's probably because she thinks that she can continue to rely on some of the chief ministers who were representing some of this diversity, including Devraj Urs in Karnataka that I have mentioned. So I would consider that this argument is indeed counterintuitive, and I would look at diversity as conducive to democracy and attacks of diversity as, on the contrary, one of the root causes for authoritarianism.
All right. Our next question is by Anshul. He offers an interesting perspective. He asks, do you see the role of the judiciary, that is the Supreme Court, in the national emergency under Indira Gandhi in reference to the ADM Jabalpur case? And do you see the judiciary as an enabler of suspension of constitutional rights? The ADM case was reversed in 2017. Do you see the Supreme Court as an entity indulging in judicial astrology, with there being no logical continuity in its decisions. Also, see it in the reference to the First Amendment to the Indian Constitution after a series of Supreme Court judgments, which were in a sense very outrageous. For example, having absolute freedom of speech and expression.
Well, that's quite a lot of questions rolled into one. And I think the basic premise is, can the courts uphold democracy in any sense? And when you look at the First Amendment that you mentioned, the important point to remember is that the courts were acting as a defender of democracy, but then it was Parliament that stepped in and decided to make curbs on free speech. And you saw pretty much the same thing in the emergency. Of course, today the situation is very different, where the courts aren't really an opposition to government as such. But what all three instances show is a very great dependence on the judiciary to take a role in politics. And I think this is a uniquely Indian malaise, if I may say so. Because I would like politics to happen on the streets in Parliament through protests. And I think there's a case to be made against juridicalization of politics, in the sense that virtually every dissent that has to come from the people has to be wound up and channeled through the courts and back to the people. So what we're really talking about is two different things. One is the role of the judiciary in society. And what we've seen is the judiciary was much happier to fight against government, against Parliament and the executive back in the day, which they aren't today. So rather than seeing that as some kind of paradox or schizophrenia, it's better to see it as, okay, this is the judiciary, these are its limits, and it's time for the people to step in after that. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
It does. If I may just add a couple of personal insights. It's not surprising that the judiciary changes in the course of time. You know, it's not astrology. It's the fact that society is changing, issues are changing, and the jurisprudence is changing. What is more disturbing in a way is the loss of independence. So the question is not so much, are the judges changing their views, but are the judges changing their views independently? And there is then a question of how do you make sure that judges retain their independence? And the way judges are appointed is, of course, a very important issue, but also the way judges can be blackmailed. And that's certainly a huge challenge.
Thank you. I think we have time for two more questions. So the next one is by Ashwin. He asks, what role did the military play during emergency? And why, even during those chaotic times, did the military dictatorship replace India's democratic system?
Pratinav, I responded the same question last week, so now it's your turn.
Well, so I think the 2 points I'd like to make. The first is that the military did not play a direct role during the emergency, in the sense that it wasn't called to actively police on people. But when we say that, we tend to overlook the paramilitaries, because there were about 2 million of them at this point in 1975. And they did play a very important role in propping the regime and making sure that its programs were actually seen through. So now you can look at Turkman Gate or countless other demolitions that happen across the country. And what virtually every report will show you is that there was some paramilitary presence keeping people in check. So that's the Central Reserve Police Force, the Border Security Force, and the like. And let me just say this, that it's not because Mrs. Gandhi believed in great civil-military relations that, the military wasn't mobilized by her. Now, as it happens, in 1977, it was not a foregone conclusion that she would relinquish office. And she did try to hold on to power with the help of the military. And it's quite regrettable that this is not better known. So after the election, she called Tapeshwar Raina, who was the chief of army staff, and had Sanjay Gandhi instruct him to station one infantry platoon in every district of the country. Now, if Sanjay and Indira had had their way, India was to be placed under military rule. And it is only because Raina refused to comply, a testament incidentally to the healthy civil-military relations that her father Nehru had fostered, that India did not see its second dictatorship in 1977.
Thank you. Okay. Our next question is by Aisha. She asks, why would a law such as declaring emergency be constitutionally allowed when it can turn the entire democratic nature of a country to a dictatorship? And it is so antithetical to the spirit of the country and the constitution.
No, this is not surprising. Each constitution has its own provision for declaring a state of emergency. In France, we have Article 16 in our constitution. Each democracy has a provision for suspending democracy in case of some risk. And that's the problem. How do you define the risk, the threat, justifying the suspension of democracy? And that's where some fine-tuning is needed. Interestingly, India was already in a state of emergency when the emergency was declared. It was already in a state of emergency since the 1971 war. And S.S. Ray, who was the legal advisor of Mrs. Gandhi, somewhat invented the notion of internal emergency because there was already an external emergency. That was a rather mythical way to look at the Constitution, because in this Constitution, there is no difference between internal or external emergency. But the point is that in any case, each democracy can undo what it is supposed to do for the sake of security. And the big problem is, when do you become a security state justifying the suspension of liberty in the name of safety? Because when you do that, when you are on that, in that vein, I would say democracy is in danger in a much more structural manner. Yeah, including the use of exceptional laws. You have MISA in the 70s, you have UAPA today. These laws are used always in the name of safety at the expense of liberty. And that's much more complicated to circumvent than a state of emergency that is a clear attack on freedom. This is much more vicious in a way.
Okay, thank you to you both. I think that brings us to the end of our question and answer session. And I'll now hand it over to Rashmi ma'am.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Pratinav. I'd like to invite, there are still some more questions. I think we could email those questions to you and you could respond to them. I'd like to invite Ankita Gujar to propose the vote of thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yes. Am I audible? Yeah. Assuming I am.
Yes,
all right.
Yes,
so, yeah, we draw to the end of the third of the 4 lectures being organized by the Council of International Programs at St. Xavier's College this year. On behalf of the organizing committee, I wish to express my sincere gratitude to the management of the college, our rector, Dr. Father Keith D'Souza, our principal, Dr. Shinde, for the unstinting support that they extend to each of our ventures. Our thanks are also due to our vice principals for academics, Dr. Karuna Gokan, for arts, Dr. Annapurna, and for the sciences, Dr. Rishikesh Samant. I must also take this opportunity to thank our speakers for the day, Professor Christophe Jaffrelot and Pratinav Anil, for their thought-provoking discussion and dialogue on the discourses on rights and freedoms in times of democratic upheaval, the causes and consequences thereof, and what points of complex civic, societal, and governmental navigations one must keep in mind through a consciousness of history to ensure an active and continued engagement with the culture of democracy. We thank you for your time, and we look forward to our continued association with you and with your school. And we offer you our sincere congratulations on the release of your latest book. This lecture was also possible due to the engaged participation of the team at Sciences, Sophie Collet, Neha Khanna, and of course the publishers Hearst and HarperCollins. Many thanks to my colleagues at the CIP and all our enthusiastic student volunteers whose consistent work was instrumental in ensuring that today's lecture was a success. Lastly, we're delighted to have had so many participants with us on Zoom as well as on YouTube. Thank you for all your questions, comments, and responses to the lecture series, and we hope to see more of you for the lectures to come. Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all. And the book is out, so you can order your books online, I suppose.
Yes.
Do you want to add anything regarding that? Anyone?
We'll sign it when we'll meet.
Exactly. Post-pandemic, of course.
Yes, you must come to St. Xavier's. Maybe we could have a session on that.
With pleasure.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.